Mrs. Ana Barreira, Senior Lawyer and the Founding Director of the International Institute for Law and the Environment. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Arkan.
Thank you very much. So let's start our conversation with this intricate relationship between law and the environment. To what extent the current principal legal instrument, that is the Paris Agreement that we have, is actually adequate to the climate challenge that we are facing?
Okay, first on your first point of your question, the interrelationship between law and the protection of the planet, I would like to say that law provides and regulates human behavior. So that's why it is so important, the role of law to protect the planet in general. And in fact, when we talk about climate change, normally people, at least in my country, always lawyers says that law sometimes is behind the needs of society. But in the case of climate change, we already have the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that was agreed and signed in Rio Conference in 1992. It was a time just 2 years after the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, published its first assessment report in which they were alerting and warning on the impacts on climate change. So we have a response by the international community, which was like a kind of, it's a framework agreement that has been developed. And first it was the Kyoto Protocol, just 3 years after the first COP in 1995. And a few years after, we had the Paris Agreement, which is the second part of your question. Okay? So is the Paris Agreement fit for purpose to fight climate change? Okay, the Paris Agreement, it was agreed in 2015. Next year it will be 10 years since it was agreed. So it contains provisions to help and to fight climate change, to adopt mechanisms, legal tools, plans in countries to face the challenge of climate change. So I would say that it is a good instrument. There is the international conversation that takes place at COPs, as we are now here in Baku, COP29, and countries, they have to agree. But after, every country, every state, representative of every state, they have to go to their own countries and to implement internally the agreements that are taken. Let me provide you an example. According to the Paris Agreement, to reach one of its objectives, that it is related to the global temperature goal, that we have to try by any means not to increase global temperature above 2 degrees Celsius, taking into consideration the pre-industrial levels, but if possible 1.5 degrees Celsius. Why? Because there is a lot of differences, according to the IPCC, on the impacts in the planet of increasing temperature 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5. So to achieve that, one of the instruments that it is provided in the Paris Agreement is that countries, they have to prepare what it's called nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, which is a kind, for the audience, it's a kind of plan on climate and energy and aspects related to sectors that impact and have a global, has greenhouse gases. So these NDCs have to be elaborated by countries, and normally plans are a legal tool. So through NDCs, according to the Secretariat, all the existing NDCs today will allow us to increase temperatures above 2 degrees Celsius, probably between 2.8 and 3 degrees Celsius. So now, in February 2025, countries, they will have to submit new NDCs. So that's why it is very important, and this is part of the negotiations here on mitigation, that the NDCs are more ambitious than what we have now. So again, through the mechanisms, this was just one of the examples, that are provided in the Paris Agreement, law is giving responses to fight climate change.
And Paris Agreement is a It's an international treaty within the meaning of international law.
Yeah.
Same applies to Kyoto Protocol,
Yeah.
but not to Copenhagen Accord of 2009, as I understand. So Paris Agreement is legally binding, but not all its provisions are legally binding. And as I understand, NDCs are not legally binding in terms of the countries are not obligation to achieve those NDCs. Please elaborate on that.
I mean, we will have to go through the Article 4 because there are some parts in which countries have to prepare those NDCs.
This is legally binding.
This is legally binding, and it is like it is a bottom-up approach because our countries that they are deciding what means they will implement internally, so they have to. Then whether they have to comply with those or not. I would say that the legal jargon should and shall makes a difference. But for example, at the European Union, we have a regulation from 2018 that member states of the European Union, each of those, they have to prepare what it's called the NECPs, the National Energy and Climate Plans, and those are legally binding. And the EU are trying by any means that we can achieve the goal which is in our NDC, collective NDC of the EU, which is to reduce emissions by 2030 at least in a 55%. So our country is not obliged to comply with NDCs according to the Paris Agreement. I would say they should because climate change affects every one of us, affects the economy of countries. You have the example of my country in which we have suffered recently a terrible flood in Valencia, and this has a tremendous cost for the insurance sector, for livelihoods. I mean, all the interventions by the state to withdraw all the impacts. I mean, all those trees, and we will have to rebuild bridges. So it has a tremendous cost, and there are many studies from an economic point of view that shows that the impact of taking no action is higher economically speaking than non-taking action. So I would say that countries, they should implement, because otherwise citizens from countries, they would say, why are we sending our delegates to these international conferences? Because citizens, they can say, okay, they are traveling around and
they're actually contributing to climate crisis as well by traveling as well.
So what for? If then also we are paying our legislators, we are paying our officials to prepare plans, and then there is not any obligation. So this might be, I mean, I would always say that this could affect the credibility of institutions when laws are not complied with, and particularly in the field of the environment. This has a cost for the credibility of institutions. Yeah?
Yes, indeed. We know that there's a general criticism of United Nations, of the COP system as well. Before moving to this COP, and my next question is going to be about that, but the current question, if I may, with your permission, my last question about the Paris Agreement. It has quite often been described as establishing middle ground between the different approaches maintained in the Kyoto Protocol and the Copenhagen Accord. I think the term used was, I think, Goldilocks solution to the climate challenge. Could you just walk us through those three key departments?
The differences?
Yeah, I mean, it is described as establishing a middle ground between different approaches. Could you just walk us through those three key departments of prescriptiveness, differentiation and legal form? Just very briefly, if I may.
Okay, yeah, I mean, first, I would say the Kyoto Protocol, that was the first instrument adopted. Yeah. It is always, I said, that law is a response also to the times we are living in. And when the Kyoto Protocol was adopted, it was 1997, which is a very different time than today. So under the Kyoto Protocol, it is legally binding as well, and they establish obligations only for Annex 1 parties. Annex 1 parties of the UNFCCC, okay? And there were obligations to reduce greenhouse gases emissions, okay? with a specific assigned amounts, which is called. And that was only for what was at that time developed countries and economies in transition, okay? And it is compulsory for those parties that ratified the agreement. And at the time, the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, for example, obliged the Annex 1 parties to reduce emissions at least by 5% in the first commitment periods that ran from 2008 to 2012, okay? And this 5% was distributed among different countries. Like the EU was the group of countries that had agreed to be more ambitious than anyone else, that was to reduce to reduce 8% of their emissions. So, but there were other countries that they have to reduce less. And I remember that in the case of Russia was just 0. They have to stabilize their emissions according to their 1990 levels, okay? So it was more a top-down approach, and also controlling, And then we have the Copenhagen Accord. The Copenhagen Accord was a result of the failure to agree on a new legally binding text, okay? So that's why after the Kyoto Protocol, because the Kyoto Protocol, as I said, the first commitment period was still 2012. So the agreement reached is not legally binding and it's very general. So that's why a new process was open to extend the bindingness of the Kyoto Protocol, and meanwhile also to negotiate for a new legal text, legally binding, but in the form, in the mandate was okay in the form of a convention or treaty or protocol, whatever, but legally binding. That was the idea. So then, during the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, countries again they have to reduce emissions, but again there was all those countries that I was mentioning. Of course, the U.S. though. During the Kyoto Protocol negotiations, there was, in the negotiations, it was the time of Bill Clinton presidency, and the vice president was Al Gore, that by the way, he was here these days before. But after the Senate of the US didn't ratify the Kyoto Protocol. But I would like to say also that in the US, the system is that US states, they have a lot of powers that deals with activities and sectors that have an impact on the emissions of greenhouse gases. So that's why, okay, the federation, it's important, but also the role of a state. So there were many states that they have been working to reduce emissions, though the US did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol, okay? And in the second commitment period was extended from 2013 to 2020, okay? And the agreement was that in as a group of countries, all in Annex 1 of the UNFCCC, had to reduce emissions at 16% by 2020. But the EU, again, always has been a leader in climate negotiations, agreed to increase emissions, to decrease emissions 20% by 2020. So we have top-down approach, a specific amount of reductions by percentages. So this is one aspect, very important key aspect of the Kyoto Protocol. When we go to the Paris Agreement it's for all countries. They have to take measures, not only developed countries, because the times has changed, the economies has grown. It's not the same how China or India or Brazil was in 1992 and 1997, their economies, than it was in the economies were in 2015. And of course, but according to the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which is one of the key principles of the convention, and according to their national circumstances. So this, in the Paris Agreement, we have a bottom-up approach through the NDCs. So every country has to take measures to do work to reduce emissions But of course, the Paris Agreement again says that with the leadership and developed countries, they have to be the ones that have to do more according to this principle. But the developing world, what is understood today as the global south, they also have to take measures. So that's why now in this COP it's so important the financial aspects in the agenda.
Now finally in 2024, and we know that discussions surrounding NCQG have so far proven to be very complicated. It looks like that developed countries expect those developing countries to contribute to that climate finance goal as well.
Yeah.
So what is your expectation? I mean, I heard the figure $500 billion mentioned yesterday. It looks like that ambition is now being sort of reduced in order to get to the point of consensus. What is your reflection on this?
Okay. It's a very difficult topic because under this agenda item of negotiations, there are many aspects, many factors. It is the amount, which is important, but also who provides the funds, and in it, and what is the origin of these funds? Because there are many people that are saying it has to be public funds, but look, you are committing to provide funds from public budgets that we don't know whether they will be adopted or not in parliaments, national parliaments. So we are talking about, like it's in a stock market, it's called the future. So it's difficult that everything comes from public budget. I understand that, of course, when the private sector, the financial sector comes, of course, they are looking for profits, there are interest rates, all these things. So we have to find a solution to all these things. And also in the agenda item, it's very important to what is considered climate finance. There are some countries that we should define what is climate finance, where these funds should be allocated for, and how these funds are being used for. There should be verification that the funds go to the right direction, So there are so many difficulties. But of course, there are many figures coming. So there was one day that was 1.3 trillion.
Yes.
Many people from civil society, they are asking for trillions. Yes, but it's important to see whether this amount can be achieved or not.
Yes, indeed,
Yeah, of course, we have to increase the amount that was agreed already in Copenhagen, the 100 billions, and that has not been complied till last year. And because then otherwise there is a lot of frustration, but of course we need to increase the financial support for the means of implementations for developing countries, because otherwise we won't be able to achieve one of the main objectives of the Paris Agreement related to the temperature goal.
I imagine if we agree on a new climate finance goal in terms of figure, its implementation is still another question. We may agree, but implementation may take years, as it was the case in relation to Copenhagen Accord. Is that so?
Of course, yeah. It takes time because you have to organize many aspects. It's like, of course, there is under the convention, there is the Green Climate Fund that provides funds for fighting climate change in developing countries, but of course, you need to organize how these funds are going to be allocated, for which projects, which institutions are going to supervise everything. So you need time. Everything. COPs takes place. Climate COPs takes place every year. It's every once in a year. So therefore, there is no time. It's like a year. It's very short period to put all the institutions and all the regulations we need for implementation. But we need to work. Not saying as it takes time, we will do nothing. No. We have to work hardly for this.
Indeed. I'm so grateful to you, and very much hopes that in the fullness of time we will have further opportunities to discuss these very intricate and complex issues. I'm so grateful.
A pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.